Who was Mark Hofmann? Part 2, Bombs. From a newspaper article by Jim Wolfe and Mike Carter. Tribune staff writers, October 16, 1985. On October 15, 1985, two people were brutally murdered by two bombs. To summarize this article, the bombs were plain wrapped cardboard boxes. One was set by the 6th floor office door in the Judge Building of Stephen Christensen, age 31, a Salt Lake businessman. He died instantly when he picked up the package. The blast was so powerful that it blew the door off its hinges. The second bomb killed Kathleen Sheets, 50, the wife of Gary Sheets, who was the intended victim. The bomb was placed on a walkway by her garage. When she picked it up, it killed her instantly. Christensen and Sheets were both high-ranking members of CFS Financial Corp. Stephen Christensen had left the company 3 months previously. The company was going bankrupt, and CFS investors were the prime suspects in the bombings. Another possibility is that the murders were ordered or carried out by someone angry about the controversial White Salamander letter, which Mr. Christensen purchased and recently turned over to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Mr. Sheets apparently helped finance research that established the letter's authenticity. A shock wave went through the entire community. Everyone was suspicious of their neighbors. Everyone who was associated with the bombing victims were going into hiding. Wild speculations were everywhere. No one dared comment lest they might be viewed as an accomplice to the crime. Salt Lake City Police Chief Willoughby believes that the bomber would have had to spend some time at each of the scenes in order to arm the explosives. You don't carry that kind of a bomb around with you armed and ready to go off, he said. Or do you? Mark Hofmann evidently carried them around fully armed and ready to go off with the slightest bump. He carried them up elevators, through hallways, across streets, apparently even drove with them sitting on the floor in front of the seat of his sports car. Very intelligent. Sheriff Hayward estimated the force of the blast to be 1.5 to 2 sticks of dynamite. They were designed with one purpose in mind: to kill somebody. News of the explosions touched off a rash of bomb threats in the city, including a call to the Salt Lake Tribune. None of the threats materialized. Then it happened. The third bomb blast in 2 days. Wednesday afternoon, a bomb detonated, critically injuring Mark Hofmann. Miraculously, Hofmann survived the blast. The pressure must have gotten to Hofmann because he obviously put bomb number 3 together without the shrapnel, or he would have died in the explosion. It happened as he was getting into his 2-door Toyota sports car. He must have bumped or dropped the bomb, detonating it just after 2 p.m. Wednesday, when the explosion propelled him into the middle of the street, splattering the road with blood and car parts. Passers-by pulled Hofmann out of the street until paramedics and the fire department arrived. His newly purchased sports car was blown apart and caught fire. By 7:30 Wednesday, police executed search warrants on Hofmann's home and burned-out car. They then found the first pieces of solid evidence in the killings of Christensen and Kathy Sheets. The Salt Lake Tribune, Friday morning, October 18, 1985, reported that after the explosion, the police found some fat checks, including a cashier's check written by Christensen to Hofmann for over $100,000 just before Christensen was murdered by Hofmann's bomb. Checks and money orders recovered from the trunk of Hofmann's gutted car by the police added up to almost $250,000, along with current forgeries he was working on. Forging supplies, parts of his bombs, making him the #1 suspect in the murders. Unbelievably, Hofmann met with high-ranking church officials who he had so long deceived with his forgeries. The very day, and just a few hours after he had murdered 2 people, Christensen and Sheets, Hofmann also met with Dallin Oaks, the church apostle. Church spokesman Don Lefevre even confirmed the meeting. Police said that they had been trying to locate Hofmann all day, Tuesday and Wednesday, for questioning because of his role in the sale of the Salamander letter, one of the 2 factors that linked Christensen and Sheets. Hofmann sold the letter to Christensen. Among the items found was an unused airline ticket purchased in Salt Lake City with a destination to New York. Hofmann was being very evasive with the police, knowing that they wanted to talk to him. Hofmann had told friends that he was afraid for his life and that he had received death threats. Those threats were not reported to police. If he was so frightened, why didn't he turn himself in? Willoughby wondered. Meanwhile, Hoffman's condition was upgraded from critical to serious condition. Officials said he suffered burns, a damaged knee, lost several fingers, had ruptured eardrums, and that the doctors were concerned about a piece of shrapnel lodged in his chest. Jerry Miller, special agent with the ATF, said, "I think a person of average mentality could construct these devices. The sophistication wasn't all that much." A large number of valuable documents thought to be of significant value to those interested in LDS church history were found in the trunk of Hofmann's car. Most were badly burned by fire and had water damage. 21 weeks later, in an article, Mike Carter, Tribune's staff writer, wrote February 5, 1986. Mark Hofmann was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the October bombing deaths of Stephen Christensen and Kathleen Sheets, and 23 counts of theft by deception and communications fraud for the documents deals that police believe formed the motive for the killings. Also, Hofmann nearly died in the blast that devastated his car the day after Mr. Christensen and Mrs. Sheets were murdered. Surrendered to police and Salt Lake County attorneys investigators at the Salt Lake County Jail early Tuesday morning. Incredulously, defense attorneys vowed that their client, labeled by the police as the prime suspect in the murders almost 4 months ago, is innocent, and said that they were relieved that the charges finally had been filed. "Now we finally have something to fight and a place to fight it in, a court of law," said defense lawyer Ron Yangich, as the litigation proceeded, and physical evidence detectives believed existed turned out to be less than incriminating. Investigators were forced to build a complex and far-reaching circumstantial case that for months failed to satisfy prosecuting attorneys. The article continued. While prosecutors would not say whether any new evidence prompted them to file charges, it has been no secret that they have been awaiting the results of tests on documents dealt by Hofmann, including the so-called White Salamander letter. While the results of those tests have not been released, sources have said that there is every appearance of forgery in some of those documents. The trial was not going well at all. The team of high-priced defense lawyers were taking all of the circumstantial evidence apart. The fear was that Mark Hofmann might be exonerated. The complex layers of circumstantial evidence was melting away, and even Utah's weak death penalty was scrutinized. In another article in the Salt Lake Tribune, staff writer Mike Carter wrote, Wednesday, April 23, 1986, bombing victim Stephen Christensen considered Hofmann a crook and was sent by the LDS church officials to tell Hofmann that he risked jail, lawsuits, and excommunication unless he repaid a loan arranged by an LDS general authority. A close Hofmann associate testified Tuesday. Insert. This was one of the last pieces of evidence entered into the trial, and incidentally, this was the last piece of evidence from Christensen before the blast that killed Christensen. The article continues. Mr. Bench's testimony also outlined for the first time the fact that Mr. Christensen discovered Hofmann was apparently trying to sell documents, supposedly belonging to the so-called Mormon McClellan collection, after Hofmann had already supposedly closed a deal for the sale of the documents to the LDS Church. Mr. Bench's testimony was preceded by testimony from Massachusetts documents dealer Kenneth Rendell, who testified a number of documents shown to him by investigators, all sold by Hofmann, appeared to be forgeries. Mr. Rendell, however, maintained he could not say the 1830 Martin Harris White Salamander, a document he helped authenticate for Mr. Christensen 3 years ago, was a forgery. But given that it was in admittedly bad company, coming from the same source as a number of apparently forged documents, he told Fifth Circuit Judge Paul G. Grant he is skeptical of its authenticity. Another point against the Salamander letter was that Hofmann's account of its origin apparently was not true. Later Tuesday, longtime Hofmann friend and associate Lynn Jacobs said that it was Hofmann, not himself, who found the Martin Harris letter. But Hofmann asked him to lie the fact from the LDS Church, which was initially approached to buy the letter, and later from Mr. Christensen, who paid $40,000 for that document and then donated it to the church. Mr. Rendell also testified about 2 pieces of ancient Egyptian papyrus he sold on consignment to Hofmann in September of 1985. 2,000-year-old chapters from the Egyptian Book of the Dead that other witnesses have said purported by Hofmann as being part of the McClellan collection. Historical reference to that collection says it contained papyrus used by church founder Joseph Smith to translate the Pearl of Great Price. A portion of one of the pieces of papyrus was found in a safety deposit box leased by Mr. Christensen, and the other large intact piece was found in the trunk of Hofmann's car. Mr. Rendell acknowledged under questioning by Deputy Salt Lake County Attorney that he reviewed a series of rare documents sold by Hofmann to the LDS Church and private investors, and based on his expertise, almost all showed signs of forgery, excluding the Martin Harris letter. Mr. Rendell said the color of the ink and the feel of the document seemed suspicious. He said those suspicions were grounded when he put the documents under an ultraviolet light, and they fluoresced an unusual bright blue. He said it was apparent that some chemical had either been painted on or the documents had been dipped and hung to dry. Mr. Rendell, who played a key role in exposing the Hitler diaries as fakes in the early 1980s, said he noticed a shakiness in the signature of Joseph Smith on some documents. He also said under cross-examination by defense attorney Brad Rich that there was a feeling to the documents that they had been written by the same person, that some of them could have common authorship. Mr. Bench testified on September 19th that Mr. Hofmann attempted to sell him a piece of papyrus. He said came from the McClellan collection for $40,000. He identified that ancient paper as a piece owned by Mr. Rendell. Whoops, that was a mistake, huh? Mr. Hofmann, however, had told him that the collection had been sold to the church, and when he asked about this, Hofmann's answer was evasive. Later, he said he recounted this incident to Mr. Christensen, who earlier showed he had been working with Mr. Hofmann in attempting to finalize the sale, and who knew the documents had been promised to the church. 5 days later, he said, Mr. Christensen called, looking for Mr. Hofmann, and asked Mr. Bench to relay what amounted to a warning to pay back a $185,000 loan to the First Interstate Bank obtained through Elder Pinnock. He said that certain things could occur and that Hofmann could certainly lose his credibility and credit with the church and President Hinckley. In another article in the Salt Lake Tribune, May 8, 1986, Mike Carter wrote, peering into a microscope set up in the archives of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints last December, documents analyst Bill Flynn noticed an unusual flaking of ink on a number of important historical church documents. A number of the documents also displayed a curious bleeding of ink under ultraviolet light, he said. Those documents, among 461 total rare papers he examined, had one thing in common: accused bomber Hofmann. Mr. Flynn, director of Arizona State Crime Laboratory's Questioned Documents Division, testified Wednesday he believes every major document whose discovery is credited to Mr. Hofmann is a fake. Some of those documents sold for tens of thousands of dollars to such dignitaries as LDS President Gordon B. Hinckley and have challenged the very core of Mormonism. Mr. Flynn is among the last witnesses to be called in the preliminary hearing for Hofmann, who is charged in the October 15th bombings and murders of Stephen F. Christensen and Kathleen Sheets. Testimony will resume Monday when Utah Documents Examiner George Throckmorton will testify. Tribune's staff writer Mike Carter wrote in the next article, May 13, 1986. A number of printed documents sold by Hofmann, including heretofore unknown samples of so-called Mormon money, were reproduced from negatives recovered during searches of area engravers, a forensic documents examiner testified Monday. George Throckmorton, a special agent with the Utah Attorney General's office and long-awaited key prosecution witness in the ongoing Hofmann preliminary hearing, said microscopic flaws in the printed notes match flaws found on the negatives ordered by Hoffman's alias, Mike Hansen, from engravers in Utah and Colorado. Mike Hansen is believed by prosecutors and police to be an alias for Hofmann, and is the key link between Hofmann and the shrapnel pipe bombs that killed Steve Christensen and Kathleen Sheets last October 15th. On Monday, Mr. Throckmorton's testimony strengthened that apparent link. Hoffman's fingerprint was found on a receipt for a rubber stamp ordered by Mike Hansen from the Salt Lake Stamp Company. Mr. Throckmorton testified that the stamp's imprint matches an imprint found in a copy of Jack London's Call of the Wild that Hofmann gave to a Davis County orthodontist as collateral for a $40,000 loan in April of '85. Mr. Throckmorton examined every document that makes up the state's 27 charges of theft by deception and communications fraud filed against Hofmann, and his testimony bolstered earlier statements by Arizona Documents Examiner Bill Flynn, who said those documents are all fakes. In his investigation, Mr. Throckmorton said all of the documents that ultimately aroused suspicion in the two experts fell into one or both categories. All were reported to us to have come through the hands of Hofmann. Secondly, all seemed to be controversial in nature from a historical standpoint. In an effort to weaken the prosecuting attorney's strong position, the defense attorneys started grasping at straws with this lame questioning. Defense lawyer Brad Rich asked Mr. Throckmorton, a Mormon who described his beliefs as being conservative, if he believed that a salamander or toad or anything had to do with church founder Joseph Smith finding the gold plates. Over objections from the prosecution, Judge Paul Grant allowed the question, and Mr. Throckmorton answered, "I don't believe that, no." Like Mr. Flynn before him, Mr. Throckmorton also testified that he observed under microscopic examination unusual cracking in the ink of the documents sold by Hofmann, which when combined with the peculiar reaction under UV light led him to determine that in his opinion the ink had been chemically aged. This was a pivotal point in the hearings. Suddenly they had good evidence against Hofmann, which caused the defense team to eventually plea bargain the final outcome. Hofmann was quite simple when it came to the intricacies of the early Mormon religion. Hofmann never did that which he was most famous for. He never discovered one single document from that era. If an infamous document ever did exist in the first place, it speaks volumes for the Mormon Church's sterling reputation at the time. He built average bombs that he carried around fully armed and ready to blow up with a very little bump. A very dangerous and not very smart thing to do. His forgeries were a little above average and getting more and more sloppy as time went on, using modern ink, modern stamps, printing plates, etc. People were buying his forgeries based solely on his reputation, which was on the verge of collapse. It was just a matter of time. People were starting to discover his forgeries and link them to him. He was offering huge profits to investors who bought into his schemes. One of the reasons he was so successful was that people are greedy. That is why Ponzi schemes seem to work so well. Hofmann, however, did fabricate lots of forgeries that he passed off as genuine. His operation, however, became sloppy. He took shortcuts, forgot some of the loose ends, etc. It was doomed from the start to fail because as it grew, it made it exponentially easier to be recognized, to leave clues, say something out of place that would later incriminate him. As he became more famous, he also brought the scrutiny of many more professional, highly trained experts in their fields of study to examine his work. The longer he continued his charade as an early church historian, the more familiar and recognized he became. The riskier his so-called business dealings in old rare documents became. He basically had no track record of ever finding an old document, unless it was a forgery by his own hand. He did irreparable damage to the church's archives just by being allowed into that sensitive area. All it would take is a phony signature, a false symbol, a false sentence, a false name, or any combination of these would destroy the document and what it meant. Why would anyone who was raised a Mormon attack their own church like that? He systematically tried to destroy the very foundations of the church by one filthy lying forgery after another, and all the while being the hypocrite good member. At this point he is an extreme apostate and an open enemy to the church. It is truly hard to understand why a person would deliberately murder two people, to divert the attention of those who suspected him. To take their lives for what? To buy him an extra day or two? And if he was discovered, what then? A slap on the hand, a short sentence, a lot of notoriety, disfellowshipped, ruined reputation, all of these are no comparison to murder. And then to cold-bloodedly build a pipe bomb with one goal in mind, and that was to brutally murder somebody. Then to coldly deliver the murder weapon to the scene without regard for other people who might accidentally pick it up or bump it or trip over it, or secretaries or receptionists or service personnel moving it, shows a total and absolute disregard for all around him. And did he endanger his own family by building the bombs in his basement, risking detonation while he assembled them, and then carried them armed out the door? Did he not realize the danger he was placing his own wife and children in? What extreme arrogance! All he ever seemed to think about was himself. Thanks for watching.